Shooting at Fico, shooting at Trump. Who's next? The problem of terrorist attacks is escalating worldwide. Are these attacks spontaneous or meticulously planned? Are the shooters acting alone, or have they become victims of long-term informational influence orchestrated by someone? And the most important question, what will the consequences be for all of us? We know who's behind this, and we also know what their goal is. And after this discussion, so will you. Today's discussion is a follow-up to the previous roundtable, where the horrors inflicted on children by anti-cultism were revealed. Yes, I'm referring to school shootings, but beyond forcing children to kill other children, these hyenas also incite citizens to kill other citizens. For example, politicians. Anti-cultism operates in multiple spheres, and while the methods and tools may change, the rhetoric remains the same.
Exactly. And it's crucial for us to understand that all spheres of anti-cultism have a single goal: global totalitarian rule. The way they aim to achieve this is by provoking a civil war on an international level. This means creating social chaos, because they see this chaos as the means to seize power. And that's the key point. So, when we look at what's happening in society today, the destabilization of democratic institutions, the undermining of public trust in governments, in the media, but most importantly, the trust between us ordinary people, all of this ultimately leads to the disintegration of the social structures on which our society really stands. And then we have these shootings, whether political or in schools. They are just a means to further this disintegration of social structures. Therefore, we can protect ourselves only by understanding these mechanisms.
Today, we will take a closer look at a significant part of their global plan, which is precisely the shootings at politicians.
There's a common belief that a typical shooter is just a maniac, a mentally ill person without family support, or a psychopath who has yielded completely to the corrupted morals of society. But the Impact documentary shows that this is only partially true, because often the shooter is someone you would never expect.
Yes, we are going to examine and explain why this is only partially true. So let's start with concrete examples. What characteristics did the shooters of both Trump and Fico have?
Sure. Let's take, for example, Uri Tsintula. When we look at his profile, it seems like he lived a completely normal life. He had a family, he was a writer, worked in a security agency, was socially active, and even founded the Movement Against Violence, where he explicitly stated that every normal person rejects violence.
I found a quote from him from that period. Let us preserve values, that is, what has been built. Prevent the destruction of values. Do not allow hatred and violence to enter us. Let us not prepare for war, nor succumb to fear for our lives in anxiety, in despair. Let us use the power of reason, scream our pain to the world, but do not leave behind victims and ruins of a city. Let us join forces for a better quality of life. We can achieve this when we start to trust each other. And he wrote this in May 2016.
Exactly. If we discuss Tsintula, when we look at his statements and his work, especially from around 2016 and beyond, we see that he often relied on concepts like protection of the country, defense of the nation, and so on. And we see that these are genuinely noble and correct goals. But then the anti-cultists come in, and they take these noble goals and start to use them against the person himself. And then that person takes up a weapon and goes to shoot the Prime Minister, fully believing and being deeply convinced that he's doing it to protect his own country, which is absolutely insane.
When we look at Thomas Matthew Crooks, who was shooting at Trump, we see the same thing. He was a completely normal person. He graduated from high school just 2 years ago, even with honors. We know he also received some monetary award upon graduation. He worked in the kitchen of a local nursing home, and his classmates described him as a completely normal, always friendly person. He was interested in history and in government. A quiet, reserved person. No one would have ever expected this from him.
There are things they have in common. Nevertheless, I don't think we can say they are exactly the same. In the Impact documentary, it was explained and shown that school shooters don't have a uniform profile. So we can't say that a person with these characteristics will surely become a shooter. It is impossible to make such a statement. And although we have few examples, fortunately so far, it seems that even in these cases, there aren't consistent characteristics. This leads me to the method of puzzle coding, which was also explained in the Impact documentary. And behind this puzzle coding are the anti-cultists. It is important to understand that. Just as a school child can be coded to go and kill other children, an adult can also be coded to go and kill someone.
As you mentioned coding, there are many types of coding. Some are described in the Impact documentary, but there are also several types that cannot be openly discussed because they are dangerous and need to be dealt with exclusively by experts. In any case, puzzle coding involves the purposeful insertion of certain mental images that essentially bypass a person's critical perception, turning him into, he basically becomes a mere executor of the command. How does this happen? Essentially, there's a first wave that affects a vast number of people. In subsequent waves, the focus narrows. And then, during the final coding, it triggers a specific individual. Anti-cultists select the region where they operate. But as for who gets caught in their net and becomes that specific individual, even they themselves don't know that.
Essentially, it works in a way that a person receives an image in his mind that is so powerful it effectively influences his desires. It then acts as a command, and the person can physically feel that they want to carry out that horrific act. The problem is that the coding process itself is invisible to the person. He is completely unaware of it, and this is what makes it so dangerous. However, it is possible to protect ourselves by starting to monitor our reactions to the information we receive, whether it's articles, news in the media, or other sources. The moment we feel anger, aggression, hatred, or aversion towards a specific person or group, or doubts about the system we live in, about democracy itself, after receiving or reading certain information, that's a red flag. It's a sign that this coding may be embedded in that message or information. It's crucial to start paying attention to this and track which specific message triggered this reaction. It may be surprising, but the most dangerous thing is actually the doubts that can be the starting point. For example, let's say we're talking about politicians. Since that's our topic, you might have perceived a political figure completely normally or neutrally, just as he is. Then, at a certain point, doubts start to creep in. What if it's not like that? What if he isn't serious? What if he is betraying us? What if he's wishing us harm? And it's from these thoughts that everything begins.
It all starts from there, right? The key point is that if a shooter understands or recognizes the methods of this coding, he has the chance to break free from it, and that's probably what's most important. For example, if a shooter watches the Impact documentary even just a day before his planned attack, he will have the opportunity to step back from that decision because he will see and understand the external manipulation at play. The probability that he would abandon the plan increases by up to 80%. This is why it's so important to share this information, to spread it, to share the Impact documentary film. because by doing so, we can actually protect ourselves, our lives, and the lives of others. When we understand what external manipulations are being imposed on us, we are able to see them, recognize them, and most importantly, resist them.
Reject them.
Exactly. I would like to offer you, our viewers, who are watching this discussion, to watch the Impact documentary. Delve into the information presented there. The film is over 8 hours long, and what the creators managed to compile is truly remarkable. The way it explains how anti-cultism operates on many societal levels and the enormous destabilization it causes, everything we are discussing here. These are truly important insights that are worth spreading and sharing with others.
On the contrary, if a person, a potential shooter, doesn't have this information, he is driven by that external influence to commit the crime. He merely carries out the received command, and after the act is done, all the blame falls on the shooter. The anti-cultists and their accomplices remain in the shadows. And just think about it, they cast their net. They implant the command. And then, when a person goes and shoots a politician or a child kills other children, what do? They sit on the couch, drink coffee, and revel in their power.
Because they actually think they are gods. They seem to enjoy it, but what exactly are they enjoying? The fact that they manipulate innocent citizens, terrorizing them, implanting various narratives on a subconscious level to make them commit various crimes. And who are they manipulating? Ordinary people who obey the law, just living normal lives. And the only thing they did was cross paths with these hyenas. It's completely absurd. And they even relish, mainly in my opinion, their impunity, that nothing can happen to them.
That's precisely the foundation of their sense of power. Omnipotence, invisible power.
Yes.
I can imagine that many people might say, "What coding? They can't code me, it doesn't work on me." But we can do a very simple test. What comes to your mind when you hear the word sect or totalitarian cult? Do you know that these people are completely normal people like you, just with different interests? But they are essentially the same kind of people as are people in these groups, whether religious or secular. Some people like fishing, some like cycling. But it's as if someone said that those who like cycling aren't even human, that they should be imprisoned, that they're cultists, that their children should be taken away. If someone holds such views about a sect, that's direct proof that they are already being manipulated. Because this is a narrative of anti-cultists, and no one else's, only the anti-cultists.
I'd just like to add that across society, crimes can occur within various groups. That needs to be addressed, and criminal law should be applied immediately when this happens. But to categorize people based on whether they are cyclists, fishermen, or whether they follow a certain belief or have their own faith, this is where the manipulation starts. This division of people based on their interests.
Exactly, because that's the stigmatization and generalization at play. And it's absolutely insane when we can see this happening even in politics. That's why we observe that democracy is ceasing to function effectively. It's being undermined. The basic principle of democracy, which is the right to freedom of choice, where I can decide who I want to vote for, is completely disrupted. If we look at the Czech Republic, for example, regardless of political preferences, it's not about who votes for whom or who likes whom. But when we see articles coming out saying that Andrej Babiš has a Babiš sect, or articles referring to Babish's witnesses or the Babiš cult, and so on, and there are numerous such articles, they are in fact stigmatizing all of his voters. And let's take the presidential election as an example. Babiš was voted for by 2.4 million people. people. So, does that mean these journalists want to say that 2.4 million people have brainwashed minds, and that's why they vote for Andrej Babiš? That's absolutely insane. And then, when we look at the situation in America, where anti-cultists promote the idea that the entire country needs to be deprogrammed, what does that mean for the Czech Republic? Do we need to deprogram 2.4 million people? This is critical. And then there are many people. I know this from my own family experience. I have an uncle, an older man who follows politics. Yes, he voted for Babiš, and he's afraid to tell anyone. He's afraid to say, hey, I voted for Babiš. But what is wrong with that? He has the right to choose freely. What's wrong with making a decision and using your right? So here we see how anti-cultism is truly causing the total destruction of democracy. People not only fear going to the polls, but they're also afraid to even say who they actually voted for.
The discussion actually ends with this.
Exactly.
Well, in connection with this, we can now take a closer look at those two assassination attempts, both the shooting at Fico and the shooting at Trump, because both of these cases share some common features, some shared characteristics, and through this, we can see that there is one hidden force behind it all.
I have them listed here, so I'll briefly read them out. Point 1. Before the assassinations, there was a massive media campaign in both countries, which was not always based on truthful information, at least from some media outlets. But we'll get to that. Point 2. Both Trump and Fico were shot by random individuals from the crowd who had evidently been exposed to informational coding in their regions long before the incidents. Point 3. In both cases, intelligence services had no prior information about the planned assassinations. Point 4. Before and during the attacks, both shooters harbored intense hatred towards these politicians and strongly disagreed with their policies. Point 5. In both cases, some media outlets actively promoted the narrative that the attackers were lone wolves and acted independently.
Wait. This part interests me because if they acted alone as individuals and were lone wolves, how is it possible that shortly after the attacks, both the conversations on social media and the related articles in those threads disappeared? Who deleted them? Because one was dead and the other one was basically in police custody.
This is exactly what the Impact documentary is talking about. Who benefits from these messages being deleted? The reason is that those messages are part of the coding. They contain embedded codes that already turn those individuals into shooters.
So if we, or rather the experts, were to look at them, we could clearly see
We would see.
when and what kind of coding took place.
Yes. And who is behind the manipulation in their region?
So they're covering their tracks.
But then, in that case, the authorities should take the step of subjecting Cintula to regressive hypnosis since he survived. Because through that, it would be clear what codes and inserts he encountered, in which articles he read them, and then it could be easily traced back to who ordered those articles, and so where the trail leads.
Yes, it could be traced back easily.
Do you have any other points?
Yes. Point 6. In both cases, the suspects were not mentally ill. As we've already mentioned, they maintained intellectual activity, and it's noteworthy that some media outlets tried to portray the criminals as heroes, presenting their photos and information about them in the most appealing way. And as we know, glorifying criminals is one of the methods used in puzzle coding for future shooters. Point 7. Information about these information attacks was simultaneously published in the world media to create a wave of outrage, shock, sense of insecurity, hatred, confusion of the masses, and inspiration for future assassins.
In the media, yes?
Of course.
So they are basically accomplices working as supporting agents, I would call it that way, for the anti-cultists.
And therefore, it's interesting to track which specific media outlets then repeatedly and in great detail analyze these events afterward.
because it's well known that these new assassins, so to speak, are inspired by the older ones. They study the methods, how they prepared for the assassinations, and how they carried it out. And the final point. Both cases triggered a wave of public dissatisfaction with the authorities.
What does dissatisfaction with the authorities mean?
Well, basically it triggered a reaction. Take Trump as an example. He's seen as a future president, a presidential candidate. So, if the security agencies couldn't protect him, how can they protect us? This makes people start, first they start doubting their competence, whether they are even capable of recognizing or preventing a similar act or anything like that, and whether they can protect their children, themselves, and so on, if they can't protect a politician. And on the other hand, if we look at the recent assassination attempt on Robert Fico, we are already seeing similar articles in the newspapers, like the one I noticed yesterday, suggesting that they are not capable of solving the case. There are calls to General Prosecutor's Office to take action and suggestions to establish a special parliamentary commission to oversee the investigation. But that's the same narrative that emerged after Kennedy's assassination. If we look back, it's the same pattern, isn't it? Why? There are authorities that investigate these cases and follow the legal procedure as it should be. What are we trying to control here? Covering up evidence?
We're talking about political shootings, and yet the important thing is that it's not really about politics. It's about dividing people in a way that this stigmatization, for example, of the voters I mentioned earlier, like those of Andrej Babiš, leads to gradual radicalization and eventually manifests in violent acts. That's the coding process at work. It's one thing when articles are published about what Andrej Babiš did or didn't do well. That's fine. It's okay to critically examine any politician's work because they are in a position where they are responsible for the direction our society takes. That's perfectly valid. But it's something entirely different to stigmatize his voters, creating the impression, whether it's the Trump's cult in Donald Trump's case or the Babiš's sect in Babiš's case, that the voters of these politicians are somehow not fully competent, that they aren't capable of making independent decisions. And maybe it would be best to take away their right to vote because, supposedly, they have brainwashed minds.
But notice that this happens not just, to be fair, whether it's Fico voters, the Trump's cult, and so on, but the media, on the opposite side, do the same, making sheep out of the voters of Progressivné Slovensko in Slovakia, and the pattern is the same. How is it possible that both sides are using the exact same pattern? And again, it all leads to the fact that the anti-cultists don't care who will start. They have only one goal, which we'll discuss in more detail later, and they are not interested in anything else. They just keep pushing toward that goal. And you'll be surprised when we break down exactly what tools they're using for this.
Exactly. That's why we are actually talking about how all of this leads to civil war. Because there's no other inevitable outcome. The fact is, these voters, these people who vote for different political parties, could actually live peacefully side by side. But now, they can't live in peace. Not because one group or the other is bad, but because journalists, in collaboration with anti-cultists, are creating this completely twisted atmosphere in society. It's due to the stigmatization and so on. What they're really after is spreading fear that ultimately paralyzes all of us. Because whether it's a political shooter or anyone else, their main goal is to divide people and keep them living in fear.
Exactly. They divide people. There's a saying, divide and conquer. that still holds true. And if we recall the Impact documentary, it was very well stated there. If you want to understand who is behind all this, look at who benefits from it. And from all of this benefits, no one but the anti-cultists.
It's clear that politicians play an enormous role in what happens in the world and in shaping the direction of the world as a whole. And that's exactly why global anti-cultism targets them the most. How do they create this anti-politics you just described so well? Through this kind of anti-politics, global anti-cultism can easily achieve its goals. What are these goals? Anti-cultists manipulate politicians, create controlled chaos, and then destroy democracy to establish a totalitarian regime. The Fourth Reich. That's the ultimate point they are aiming for. To reach this, they use various tools, one of which is school shootings and attacks on politicians. Why do they use these tools? Because they trigger very significant and powerful processes in our society. After such an incident, the entire society is shocked.
Shattered.
Yes, so as we've described, this leads to blaming the state, the authorities, the security services, and, as you mentioned, they are blamed for failing to ensure safety. But what does this evoke in people? A sense of helplessness, simply distrust. People no longer trust each other. Anyone could become either a perpetrator or a victim at any moment. And what happens to the authority of real politicians? What happens to the authority? In the sense that, yes, we have democracy and we're leading our country somewhere, but then, in every person, there's this feeling of helplessness. No matter who I vote for, nothing will change anyway.
And that's exactly what they want to achieve, because that's when democracy as such collapses. That's when ultimate chaos emerges.
Yes.
Exactly. The idea is that every potential politician is automatically seen as bad. And if we look at society today, doesn't the majority of people have this mindset? This is a clear sign that democracy is starting to fail because people are losing faith in it. Where there is enormous distrust, it's clear that the system is crumbling. That's why it was mentioned in the Impact documentary that the first step is to establish a new world disorder. Only then can a new world order come into place. And that's exactly what's happening right before our eyes.
And what happens after every shooting? Opportunities to change legislation immediately arise. It often starts with debates like guns, yes or no. But then the next step is to tighten measures and introduce stricter control. And even though, in practice, it's been shown that these increased measures don't actually prevent such situations, they don't address the root of the issue, what do they create in society? One group of people, driven by immense fear, calls for stricter measures. And at the same time, another group emerges, driven by hatred towards the authorities, arguing, no, this isn't possible because you're cutting our rights. You're actually consolidating your power. We, as people, won't be able to respond in any way. And this creates two opposing groups.
And in the end, those two groups will end up going against each other, right? Because each feels that the other is somehow threatening or obstructing them. This creates civil unrest. A huge amount of hatred is born. And nothing can be traced back to the anti-cultists. They just sit in the shadows, watching and reveling in their power.
Yes.
Meanwhile, people are killing each other.
But then, this will just lead to the authorities tightening their grip even further, implementing stricter legislation just to prove that they have everything under control. In the end, this will be aimed against the people. The only ones who will strengthen their position will be the anti-cultists and their minions in the government structures, who will actually strengthen their power in this way. And as the saying goes, you know how they say, take everything from the people and then give them back only half. And they will kiss your hands and feet, so they will come and say, well, we have restored order and so on, and democracy will be over.
Well, that's precisely it, because the ultimate goal of the anti-cultists is to establish their totalitarian regime, the Fourth Reich, basically. And they do it in such a way that they create such unpleasant, unbearable conditions for life in society, and create such chaos that people just can't stand living in it. And then they make us as a society actually beg for their totalitarian regime.
Exactly. Which is sick.
That's crazy. And that's why you need to know, to speak up about protecting democracy itself, so that this doesn't happen. Well, let's delve deeper in this even more. Let's look from the beginning at what methods are being used and how the anti-cultists actually want to bring us to this point. Donald Trump, one of those who has long been subjected to a powerful disinformation campaign, where the central theme is the word cult, and where he's actually labeled as a cult leader. And what contributed to this a lot was a book written by the American anti-cultist Stephen Hassan in 2019 called The Cult of Trump. What is worth noting here is that this book and its rhetoric in general doesn't just dehumanize Trump, it dehumanizes all of his voters, which is a huge, huge number of people.
Yes. Stephen Hassan indeed uses Nazi methods in his book. One method is called guilt by association, and then there are methods of dehumanization. The guilt by association method says that once a person is part of a certain group, he's already guilty. And in this case, it's all of Trump's supporters, sympathizers, and voters. Once you vote, you're already part of that cult. And on top of that, Hassan is comparing Trump to figures that the public perceives as extremely destructive.
Exactly. The typical example here is Jim Jones, who is the guy who, in fact, established a cult called the People's Temple. And what this Jim Jones did was really crazy. People there committed a mass suicide where over 900 people died at once. And now they compare Trump to this man, to this psychopath.
As a politician.
As a politician. Exactly.
I'll just add that today Stephen Hassan is referred to as a consciousness control expert, despite the fact that in the past he was a member of the criminal organization CAN, Cult Awareness Network, which practiced forced deprogramming, which means kidnapping, forcible detention, using various physical, psychological, and even sexual violence against people. And even though there's direct evidence that he was directly involved in that, the American media still give him the opportunity to continue his activities.
And they paint him as an expert.
Unfortunately.
And yet, he is far from the only expert in America, a self-proclaimed expert who, in fact, should have been in jail a long time ago. Another typical example is Rick Alan Ross, who is connected, this was also thoroughly examined in the Impact documentary, with the Waco case. This Rick Alan Ross managed to program the members of the security forces, which is why the situation ended as it did. It was a total massacre. What happened in Waco, the way it's analyzed in the Impact film, is completely insane. Rick Alan Ross was one of the main actors in the sense that he constantly convinced authorities and security forces of the necessity to crack down on the Davidians, the peace-loving people. His influence on the decision-making processes was simply enormous, despite the fact that he actually lacked adequate qualifications.
Neither education nor anything, but both the FBI and ATF listened to him. And I remember the case because that's when we came to America, and it was very actively discussed. It was right after that. And mind this, the whole thing started again by planting articles in the media just on the basis of both Alan Ross and other anti-cultists who have explicitly provided negative propaganda for this essentially peaceful movement. And Then they started feeding these narratives to the security forces who were investigating whether it was illegal possessions of weapons, illegal use of explosives, abuses, and so on. The truth is that none of this has been confirmed. And the psychologists who then came there at the time of the siege, one of them said that he felt that it would be necessary to somehow bridge that psychological barrier on the part of those members of that movement who were under siege. And he said that when he got there, he found that actually bridging the psychological barrier needed the security forces, who actually had like a red bundle in front of their eyes and perceived that at any moment from that settlement where those participants were living, an attack would be launched against the US government. And that was only because Alan Ross was actively feeding these narratives that you were talking about.
Exactly, which is absolutely insane. He's really turned them into terrorists. Yet we know that there were many children, there were infants, there were people of retirement age, elderly people, and he turned them into potential terrorists. Unbelievable. And now we see that anti-cultists are infiltrating the security agencies and training them. And this Rick Alan Ross is far from the only case of these anti-cultists being similarly connected to the security services, right? I don't know who else is one of those.
In the movie The Impact, Alex Alvarova was mentioned, who even wrote the book Feeding the Demons. And she had one more book there, Industry of Lies. Yes, that's right. And this is... Now we were looking recently that she's actually training NATO officials. But we'll talk about that later. We'll get into it there. That actually what's going on there. But exactly, she's training like these security agents, and actually it's sick.
Like a carbon copy. I recall one more point, which was discussed at other roundtables when the representatives of the apologetic center of the anti-cultists of that time were training the Gestapo. And thanks to that, the Gestapo was already maltreating the various representatives of the minority groups of that time. Again, the pattern is exactly the same.
That's horrifying. But let's go back to Trump. In addition to being labeled a cultist, he's been compared to a fascist several times. And based on such a message in the media, Crooks could have very easily yielded to that. He was driven by heroism. He felt he was saving America, while Trump, on the other hand, was labeled a fascist. With those dehumanizing labels, anti-cultists showed Crooks that Trump was the enemy. And so, we've got a savior, and we've got a fascist. And the shooting can begin.
Here's another interesting parallel with school shootings. Basically, those kids there are sort of obsessed with the lust for fame. And here, when we read or actually see Trump, Fico, and their shooters, actually both of them are driven by heroism or a desire to save the world.
Which again is the desire for fame, right?
Which is actually also...
Interesting. Well, you mentioned Fico. That's actually another important player in today's discussion because he, like Trump in America, has been criticized. He has been a target of a discrediting campaign in the media for a long time in Slovakia. And he has been a victim of a huge amount of negative news and misinformation. But what else is very interesting is that he actually became a hindrance to RTVS, the mouthpiece of the anti-cultists. That is why they attacked him so fiercely.
Well, yes, not only he was, but in fact he still is. the target of this massive anti-campaign against him. To criticize, please, that's fine. But when I criticize somebody, I have to say what they did wrong and why they did it wrong and how we can fix it and what we think needs to be done better. But here, all you've got in the media is simply only a dehumanization campaign, simply, and even through the former state television, RTVS, which I think has been correctly reorganized because also the concession fees have been abolished, that is to say, and it is paid for from the state budget. This means that the state should have some kind of control over what is broadcast on state television in terms of content, so that there are no massive dehumanizing campaigns simply directed against one politician and that's it. After all, that's simply state television is supposed to be balanced. And take what Cintula said afterwards, after he tried to assassinate Fico, that he was upset about what he had done with RTVS.
So RTVS, which was mentioned by Fico's shooter,
An explicitly massive campaign that, encoding through feeding those narratives, led him to take the initiative and tick off and do this act, which is to say, the opposition, of course, reacted classically, as all politicians did, that it's a terrible act and all that. But it didn't last long. And again, under the influence of the anti-cultists, we are already going through this same narrative again, where again they are just riling up the public, and that's both on one side and on the other. Because also the voters or the sympathizers of Smer or Robert Fico have the same, I would say, language abilities, to be polite, for the current opposition. And this in turn only leads to one thing, to divide society, to cause chaos, to then cause civil unrest and even civil war. Even Robert Fico, in his last or penultimate social media entry, I think it was on Facebook, said that he wouldn't be at all surprised if the next shooter was already prepared and who is going to be his target this time. Because that's what this is leading up to. They will stop at nothing until they reach their ultimate goal, and we are not talking about the opposition now. We are talking about those who are feeding the politicians those narratives to achieve total control and the Fourth Reich. Now, as much as the viewers may smile and smirk at that, and that it's exaggerated and so on, no, it's not exaggerated. Trace back over the last period of time and see how that aggression is rising, and where is it leading to?
That's why it's really so important to learn about the methods, because only when you see the methods, the patterns emerge. You can see that it's like a carbon copy, and it can be seen that the hatred in society is really activated on both sides, and the only beneficiary, the one who benefits from it, is the anti-cultism. That's why it's important to watch the Impact documentary, where this is discussed a lot more deeply than we're discussing at the roundtable now.
And when we return to RTVS, which was mentioned by Fico's shooter, it has been repeatedly observed that RTVS actively spreads anti-cultist narratives and publishes content that violates democratic principles. So now the question is, what drove the shooter to decide to commit the crime? Was it hatred for the enemy or a savior complex?
Saving the country or something like that? But there's that irony, that those two fully loaded magazines show that he was very committed to this rescue mission.
But as we've already discussed, the goal wasn't a murder as such, but rather saving the nation from the enemy.
Yes.
And this mindset had been created by the media long before the actual assassination.
So, to sum it up, the problem of this year is terrorist attacks. These are assassinations, but it's not a matter of competing political parties. It's about a certain force with its own agenda, manipulating human consciousness, creating its puppets, and achieving its goals through them. The media is being used as a tool to deliver the information that eventually codes people. It's also important to emphasize that the key word in this context is cult or sect. Labeling groups and people as cultists or sectarians and so on. Because this is how an enemy, which can then be targeted, is formed. But it's crucial to understand that any image of an enemy endangers the entire society because it creates chaos. This leads to civil wars, where we all end up suffering. And this enemy image is being created by the anti-cultists. We should track where and when such negative labels and associations appear, and immediately start investigating who created them.
I would like to continue with, since we have thoroughly analysed the case of Fico, we should also discuss the specifics of the shooting at Donald Trump. Because I want to emphasise once again, this is not about any political preferences or sympathies. What we need to focus on here is showing the mechanisms,
That pattern.
the pattern that anti-cultists use to destroy society. Because, for example, I found a very interesting article on Act Files which very well explains what the real goal of the attacks on Donald Trump was. It wasn't about killing Donald Trump, but about destroying him. And that's a significant difference, because destroying means creating the impression that he actually ordered the assassination attempt on himself, that he's the one who orchestrated it just to make himself appear as a terribly suffering figure, willing to sacrifice his own people for it. And that's exactly what it was about, and it's very well described. I would recommend our viewers to find that article on Act Files, read it and analyse it, because it really shows that the attack on Donald Trump is much more than just a violent act itself. It's actually a staged performance, a theatre for the masses, which creates the image that Trump is capable of anything, that he would even order an assassination attempt on himself just to become the president again, and that he would sacrifice all people in the process, and so on.
But that's exactly the same thing that was present in Slovakia after the assassination attempt on Robert Fico. Do you get it? So it's like a pattern being copied. Or rather, first, the same was said here, and then the same narrative was used after the attack on Donald Trump, yes, to keep the chronological order as it happened. But it is also suggested that he did it to himself because he recovered suspiciously quickly, so to boost his ratings and so on. People, are you sane?
Exactly. The paradox here is that, on the one hand, the anti-cultists are actively and obviously using the method of puzzle coding, as mentioned in the Impact documentary. They code someone to carry out an attack, and then those very anti-cultists push a narrative within society that the politician actually orchestrated the attack on himself. It's unbelievable. But what I also want to say is that in all cases, what the anti-cultists continue to do is to blame all problems in society on Trump, just as everything is blamed on Fico. And similarly, everything in the Czech Republic is blamed on Babiš. It's always the same story. But who benefits from making people believe that Trump is organizing attacks on himself? Neither the Democrats nor anyone else really benefits from this, except for the anti-cultists themselves.
What is interesting is that the anti-cultists have specifically targeted those politicians who have a huge number of supporters. In some way, these politicians have managed to captivate the public, and by slandering them, the anti-cultists are, in fact, slandering everyone, including their voters.
Exactly. And this also relates to the incident during the assassination attempt, where many connections were shown. When you piece it all together, it starts to make sense. How the security services acted that day was, I would say, completely irrational. For example, usually when Donald Trump makes a public speech, drones are used. These drones monitor nearby buildings, checking if there's a shooter hidden somewhere. Well, on that day, the drones were not used at all. Another thing, in the article on Act Files, it is shown and explained that the security services could have intervened much earlier against the shooter, but they didn't. So once again, we have a series of unfortunate coincidences, much like in the case of Waco, as we have already discussed, which, as it turns out, are not coincidental at all. But this is exactly what happens under the dictate of the anti-cultists.
Yes. While the public is busy looking for culprits among opposing rivals, the anti-cultists, the ones truly responsible, continue toward their goals. These puppet masters, who code the shooter, who force him to pick up the gun and start shooting, sit comfortably in their chairs, writing more articles and coding more people. They savor their power, probably feeling like gods because they manipulate other people's lives. But it's a perversion that they feel godlike when they take lives. It's completely delusional. They are maniacs. They are maniacs, and we need to stop them. They need oversight and strict control to prevent them from carrying out more actions. And anyone who would oppose such control is either already manipulated by anti-cultists or is an anti-cultist himself.
But they don't just use the negative narrative. They even use the positive ones. We just watched a movie about the mafia boss in Slovakia, Mikuláš Černák. And when we looked at the statements from both the director and the actors, especially the main actor who portrayed him, he said that Černák was just a normal person, that he supposedly protected people and fought against the corrupt government, and that the people in his village liked him. They are basically creating an image of him as if he was Robin Hood. And we can further expect. And there was also one comment that the actor found it easy to play this role, but couldn't imagine playing someone from the current government coalition, which is just another manipulation of information. So now we can only wait for someone else to grab a gun and pretend to be Robin Hood, going out shooting to protect citizens against the evil government.
This is exactly the transformation of the image of a mass murderer into a hero, happening right before our eyes. This is what they are now presenting to us as role models.
He was ordinary mass murderer.
Yes.
Because they want us to kill each other. Because they are creating a civil war. You see, we have now shed light on the activities of the anti-cultists, especially at the political level, which is very crucial. But it's not the only level. There are multiple spheres, as we have mentioned, and the activities of anti-cult organizations fighting alleged sects and cults that operate in the Czech Republic as well are equally relevant to us. And these anti-cultists are now trying to defend themselves, saying, "Oh, Alatra is dehumanizing us, accusing us of what it does itself." No. Alatra does not accuse anyone. These hyenas are accused by law and truth. We speak the truth, and people won't forget that.
And we won't forget either. We have personally lived through their terror for 10 years, and it will not be forgotten by the people who have lost their health because of you, because you spread hatred, stress, and division in society. And most of all, the parents of the children whom you made victims won't forget, whether by turning them into perpetrators or because they died in gunfire. And the internet, it remembers all of this. Nothing will stay hidden.
And the anti-cultists keep shouting, "Beware of the sect," just like the Nazis once did. They keep trying to hide what their true goal is, but the truth has already come out. Now everyone will find out and they will see what their real objectives are. You still have the nerve to write articles, so let me give you some advice. Go ahead and write an article about what your true goal is: to have children kill children and people kill people.
But they don't want to do it directly. They want to stay in the shadows and keep manipulating. But the question is, will those who they manipulate allow them to stay in the shadows? Not a chance. All those you've manipulated will pull you into the light. And some are already doing so.
Yes, and that is simply inevitable because it's already clearly visible how anti-cultism is trampling over democracy. The anti-cultists point fingers at those they don't like and make them targets.
They are maniacs, and even worse than maniacs because a maniac acts on his own, but these people force others to kill. They force children to kill other children, and it is absolutely incomprehensible how it is possible that until today, police have not addressed it.
Why didn't address it? Because they train the police, and the police take their opinion as the guiding one and are entirely under their influence. This is the reason why in Waco happened what has actually happened there. And also same happened after the attempt on Trump's life, or rather before the attempt on Trump's life.
It's possible that they didn't know. Maybe until now you didn't realize who you were dealing with, but now the truth is being spoken out loud. Now you know. So why would you continue to listen to them?
Well, as before or differently? Because, as we have mentioned, Alex Alvarova, who is training representatives of NATO on what hybrid warfare is and how does it actually work, considering that she's a sympathizer or even a supporter of anti-cultists, if not an anti-cultist herself, what might her training sessions look like? How will NATO troops, or the organization being trained, respond when their main role should be to protect the interests of the people? And ultimately, it might turn out that they will be protecting the interests of anti-cultists instead. Where will this lead to? Are we going to face another Waco, but on a global scale?
And anti-cultists are not only active in multinational institutions, but also in universities. They essentially misuse their teaching power, their authority as educators, to groom the next generation of anti-cultists. A self-proclaimed expert, this anti-cult expert, labels someone with the sect yellow star. They write a letter, and in doing so, they completely disrupt families, destroy jobs, ruin neighborly relationships, send armed forces to homes with children, and take children away.
These are exactly the ones who attach a label of a cult. And what happens to the children they take away? In many countries, these children are sent to correctional facilities or social institutions where they are tortured, they are raped, and a large number of them disappear completely, and no one ever knows their fate. The anti-cultists are the ones who use gas on children, just like the Nazis used gas to kill Jews. Just like they used it in Waco. They killed small children by gassing them. The anti-cultists are the ones who force children to kill other children, who force people to kill other people. And these hyenas say they protect children? Isn't that their frequent argument? We care about children. We want to help them. We want to save them. So how are you helping them? By killing them? But we won't fall for it. We won't listen to your justifications because we know who you are. And we know your goal. And rest assured, people won't forget either. Rest assured, you will answer for all you've done and for collaboration. Rest assured, there will be many questions for you, and you will have to answer them all. And your defendant's bench, where you will sit side by side, will be very long. This process is already inevitable.